Seventh Royal Infantry was hemmed in by fog, limiting visibility to just a few feet, and Major Cecil Clempston was bored. He had hoped that a posting as garrison commander at St. Brelade, in view of the French coast, would have meant excitement, but no such luck. This odd scrape with the Americans was the most exciting thing that had happened since he arrived 6 months ago, but it was still managing to be nothing more than a long, tedious wait, since the Americans still hadn't actually shown themselves. He knew they were out there, somewhere in the mist, and under different conditions that would have made him nervous, even fearful, but he was confident in the superiority of his forces and their overwhelming numbers, and not worried in the least. His naval counterparts had assured him that the tiny fleet of the American Expeditionary Force had landed no more than a handful of troops last night, a few score at most, and not a single cannon. By contrast, he had a full regiment, armed with the very latest rifle, guns, and quite resplendent in their beautiful red uniforms. He felt sorry for the Americans, really. Their expedition into Europe was not without merit. Going up against Napoleon II was no small matter, and he encouraged anyone who wanted to pull the tail feathers of that strutting imperial peacock to go right ahead, and to pull hard. But toying with His Majesty's garrison out here in St. Brelade was a mistake and could not be tolerated. The Major stifled a yawn and shivered a little in the clinging damp. It was unfortunate that he'd have to humiliate these misguided yokels, but he admired their audacity. Word had come that they'd pulled off some sort of rout at Ephesia. Horrible place. It was an island prison fortress, a factory of death. He'd seen it from afar on passage to Alexandria, a sort of hell on earth with its incinerators and belching chimneys, a place where the French had sent all the werewolves they captured and made them work and work until they were too weak to go on, then burned to fuel the same machines they'd been chained to. Clempston was no werewolf lover, to be sure, and it was distressing to him how the Americans acted as though werewolves had rights. Just imagine treating those shape-changing freaks as though they were people. That was a revolting concept, but something about the way the French dealt with the werewolf problem was unsavoury. He didn't mind the thought that their death factory had been destroyed, though he did wonder a little what had become of the former inmates. The dense mist left droplets of condensation on every surface, adding to Major Clempston's discomfort and his strong desire to get this nonsense over with. The Americans couldn't have slipped past them, even in this fog. Or could they? He'd had sentries posted all night long, watching the beaches, waiting for the first sign of movement. They would be found, of course, in time. With such a pitifully small force, with no cavalry or artillery support, their commander Lawrence would surely surrender rather than fight. Even a backwards and perverse nation of werewolf-coddling maniacs like theirs would have the good sense not to do anything foolish. Surely this Lawrence fellow would do the honourable thing. Yes, he said, patting his horse to calm her down. Any moment now, it would all be over and he'd ride home to accolades and another medal. But where were the Americans? It was time for them to show themselves, so this tiresome waiting would be over. My, his poor horse had gotten very jumpy all of a sudden, whinnying and snorting. Perhaps the waiting had gotten to her as well. There was, in his opinion, nothing worse than boredom. The wind started to pick up and storm clouds rolled in from the north. The fog thinned just a little, and Major Clempston noted movement out of the corner of his eye. He looked over his shoulder to see a row of large shapes that had slipped in behind his carefully drawn-up formations of troops, all facing towards the sea. Those huge shapes moved through the fog in perfect silence, with impossible speed and superhuman agility. In the span of 2 heartbeats, they had moved through his lines, mowing down his men before they could even raise their beautifully wrought firearms. There was just enough time for Major Clempston to note how their eyes blazed, lit from within by an unsettling light in a weird array of colours, luminous greens, pale blues, flickering umbers and yellows. Something very large and dark leapt from his flank, something wearing an oversized uniform and a dented metal chestplate. Time seemed to slow down as he fell out of the saddle, borne to the ground by the thing that loomed over him. It carried no weapon. It didn't need to, not when it had talons like meat hooks that pinned him to the ground, or those long, terrible jaws filled with razor-sharp teeth, opening wide. As those nightmare jaws closed around his throat, Major Clemston realized that he had been wrong about many things in his life. The wisdom of caution, for one thing, the respect due one's opponent, and the dangers of snobbish overconfidence. Thrashing and shaking as the light of his vision ebbed, in a final burst of clarity, he realized that there were some things that were much, much worse than boredom.